the notes are the same notes that we've been working on. They're World War I, Russian Revolution, Versailles. It's all in the same note packet. But this is kind of a big deal event, and certainly one that you may not be as familiar with. So we're going to kind of set the stage. I've been talking about this for a while. I told you that if Russia ever does have this seminal event, it's going to be nasty because they've had opportunities for hundreds of years to be able to make some reforms or make some accommodations, but at every turn they haven't. And so when you're looking at the stage, there's a lot of different groups that are upset for a lot of different reasons at Tsarist Russia. And the only thing that is really saving this from coming to some kind of conclusion is that the war breaks out. And that the war will at least delay the inevitable. But then it's going to be worse if the war goes bad, because then you compound the inevitable with their dissatisfaction with the war. All right, so it's only going to heighten their disgust, if you will. All right, but the other thing is that you're certainly going to need an architect, somebody that is ultimately going to prepare this revolution, a theoretician, and they have one. All right, and it comes in the form of this character named Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. All right. No, it's not Putin. Different dude. It's this cat. All right. So I'll put him on the board so that you can see. Oh, really? Come on. Just open it. There we go. So there's Lenin. Probably can't see it, but anyway, here's the guy that is going to be the one that is somehow making a miracle, which is, how the hell is Marxism going to fit in Russia? Because when Karl Marx is writing in Britain, he's looking at industrialized England in the 1840s and looking at a society that has gone through a full development of capitalism and is urbanized and is industrialized and has an active concentrated proletariat and an active concentrated bourgeoisie, to get to a place where they believe that there's going to be some incompatibility in the capitalist structure, and that the capitalist structure is so awful towards this proletariat group that the proletariat group will eventually get to a place where they can't take it anymore and they'll overthrow the order. Russia does not look like that. Russia is predominantly illiterate, predominantly agrarian, and would be described by most that saw it as a feudal state. Not feudal, like it's like give up on it. You could say it's that too, but it's also a feudal state, F-E-U-D-A-L, meaning that you still have aristocrats and you still have landowning issues. And even though the peasants that were granted some kind of land in the Agrarian Reform Act of 1905 and 1906, you haven't seen like the fruition of that, where the peasants have actually got their small plots of land and are starting about the business of being proprietors. Okay? So all of that is still there, and we know that there's been a delay on the idea of representative government, even though they did have a 1905 revolution. All right? But Lenin is, I'll just go back here and kind of give you a little bit of background, but as far as the early days go, Lenin was associated with revolutionary groups, and it's actually his brother that I believe was arrested in the 1880s, and the unrest that surrounded Alexander II's assassination, and then the rise of Alexander III and all of the reactionary and oppressive policies that followed Russification too. Lenin got out of the country. Okay, ended up in Switzerland, which is a good place to be. I mean, if you're fleeing trouble, Switzerland's a good spot. And eventually made his way to England. And that's where his ideas started to get conceptual. He started to get his theory together. All right? And he's a dedicated Marxist. He reads Marxism and understands it, and understands capitalism to be the predatory, exploitive thing that he thought it was. But what really helped him kind of modify his ideas was a reading of a work from Sidney and Beatrice Webb called The History of Trade Unionism. Now, does anybody understand what that is, or has heard of Sidney and Beatrice Webb? What did they found? You guys remember Ballets Socialism? Okay, so that's the brand of Ballets Socialism in England. It's called Fabian Socialism. Does everybody remember that, or at least remember that name? It's the precursor to the Labour Party in England. And kind of the concept of the history of trade unionism is that belief that Marx was wrong. Marx believed that there was going to be an inevitable violent overthrow of capitalism, and at the end of the 19th century, a lot of these mature, like growing democracies that were industrialized said, no, you know, it hasn't been that bad. The workers aren't exploited the way they used to be. All right? Well, Lenin's got a logic to that. Okay? He's pissed at the trade unionists. He sees them as sellouts. And so this is what helps him develop his modifications. Because remember, when Marx is looking at the working class, his belief in the inevitability of revolution was predicated on the working class as a collective overthrowing the order. And what he noticed about the working class is that they were too impressionable. Okay? They were too spontaneous. And you guys remember me talking about cookies at all? Okay, so the modern liberals had a cache of cookies, right? And they come in the form of universal suffrage, the ability to form a labor union, the ability to strike, the ability to reduce the workday from 12 to 10, the ability to get accident insurance, factory acts that limit, child labor or whatever. Those are cookies. The working class is suffering. We have horrible living conditions, so I give you a cookie in the form of the sanitation laws. All right? We have abusive workplaces, so I give you a cookie in the form of some factory act that was passed. And that was the point. It's like a child that's upset. It's like, so-and-so pulled my hair. And then you're like, hand him a Chips Ahoy. And he's like, okay? So you imagine the working class going along and they're like upset about something. Like, 14 hours, 80-hour work week, and low wages. And it's like, minimum wage, universal suffrage. Okay? Do you understand? They're getting bought. And what Lenin is trying to suggest is they're stupid in believing that the cookies that they're receiving, they own the whole bakery. Do you understand? The working class produces all of the wealth. They do all of the work. All right? The Marxist idea that they control the means of production and distribution, that was the goal. But that was taken from them by predatory capitalists. So it's like them stealing the bakery from the working class and then using the cookies produced by said bakery and bribing them with the cookies that really belong to them. And then having them be grateful that you gave them the cookies that actually belong to them. So what Lenin is doing is like, we'll say Laura is like one of those working class people that's coming along and like somebody's holding out a cookie and she's ready to grab it. And somebody is a revolutionary, a pro. That's what he invented in this thing called What Is to Be Done in 1902, was the concept of a revolutionary vanguard. Dedicated professional Marxists that would grab Lauren by the back of her, shirt collar and say, "No! Put that cookie down. We are going to take the bakery." Do you understand? Pull them off their track and say, "Stop. Stop being distracted. We got work to do. Don't you realize that they're just trying to bribe you?" Okay? Giving you a cookie.
What was that?
But the whole thing, I don't know if I can reproduce that.
Was that like the revolutions?
That's an adaptation that he is making in Marx. It's called like the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's called a revolutionary vanguard. He says that in order for Marxism to succeed, it needs a dedicated group of professionals that will keep everybody on the path to the bakery, as opposed to being distracted by the cookies, and then being anesthetized at the chocolatey goodness of the cookie, and not realizing that they're being screwed over by the capitalist master. All right, yeah. Go ahead, finish.
Okay. In the notes it says 2 tactics of social democracy.
I haven't gotten to that yet.
Okay, that's not that.
That's a different thing, yes.
So in this analogy, it would be like, so let's say there's a
Yes,
who would be running the bakery?
they would.
Like,
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the dictators would take over the bakery so that they could teach everybody how to bake and how to share the cookies with everyone.
So.
Do you understand?
Like
There's a logic that would say that the state would ultimately wither away, but that you need the dictatorship of the proletariat in order to guide them to that eventual withering away. Okay? Marx believed that it was just going to happen on its own. Lenin said, no, you need guidance in order to make sure that it happened. And by the time we get to Stalin, the dictatorship never withers away. It becomes the dictatorship over the proletariat. Okay, that's the adaptation off of Marx. And that's why when people say communist is bad, it's because it got bastardized over the course of time. Now, Lenin probably thought well of this and said, here's a deficit that I noticed in human nature, and this is what we're going to do to try to correct that deficit. Okay? The second one is two tactics for social democracy, or two tactics of social democracy, and that's where he recognized that if Russia were to have a Marxist revolution, it would not look like the Marx revolution that Marx had in mind when Marx thought of a Marx revolution. Okay? That's where I said, in order for capitalism to overthrow feudalism and then grow in its maturity and then eventually be overthrown by communism, you'd have to go through those stages in a very natural progression. But if you're looking at Russia, which is a predominantly agrarian society with peasants that are still tied to the soil and landowning aristocrats called boyars and all of that other stuff, they still have a lot of work to do. They haven't had a bourgeois capitalist overthrow of the feudal order to get to communism. So he's kind of skipping steps in a way. And he said, here's what we do. The two tactics are that we have the organization of the workers in industrial capitals that will seize control of the means of production and distribution. But while that's happening, the rural areas will have almost like he's taking populism and incorporating it into his brand of Marxism. So that we have an agrarian peasant uprising at the same time that we have an urban worker uprising. And that both of those things can be controlled simultaneously. And that's weird. And certainly when we watch how this actually gets applied, it ends up creating a really, really bad manufactured famine. Okay? Because you might be able to do it in the cities, but it's going to be very hard to do it in the countryside. Okay? And I'll explain why, certainly later on. Okay? Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, we already talked about this one, but this was Lenin kind of sitting back, and he's still in exile. But World War I is happening now. All right? And at that point, he's looking and saying, aha, Marx is still right. Remember that story was that all of those Western European democracies said, no, the working class has got higher wages, and they got better working conditions, and they've got all these other offerings. So therefore, capitalism really isn't exploitive. And that was the point that I told you, where capitalism started to expand into the so-called third world, and that exploitation wasn't taking place in Britain anymore. It was taking place in sub-Saharan Africa, or in Asia, or in Central and South America. And he said, the fight is ultimately going to be capitalist states that are fighting each other over controlling those third world markets. And that's where ultimately the last stage of capitalism will happen. So it ends up happening on the periphery rather than happening in Western Europe where Marx had originally conceived it to happen. Okay? But all the way you can see that Lenin is still, it's almost like he's an apologist for Marx. Saying Marx, yeah, he got it right, but he didn't account for this, so I'm accounting for that. Hey, Marx got this right, but he didn't account for this, so I have a response to that. Okay? He's like, in debate terms, he would be giving the 1AR. All right? Okay. So if Edward Bernstein is giving the NC, then Lenin would be giving the 1AR. That would make sense to Julia and nobody else, and I apologize for that. So, anyway, back to the story. So Lenin is there, and he's setting up an ideology that will ultimately become the Bolshevik Party. And that's another thing that they don't talk about, but there's a key, crucial thing that takes place in London where Marxist Russians are getting together and trying to formulate what the plan is going to be. And there's a split that occurs among Russian Marxists into these two categories. One is called Bolshevik, and one is called Menshevik. Okay? Lenin is a Bolshevik. He's the one that has these adaptations with a revolutionary vanguard and an agrarian simultaneously with an urban, like two tactics revolution. Okay? The Mensheviks are more organic in believing that Russia has to go through a mature capitalist phase before it can be overthrown by a communist phase. And Lenin's like, I don't know what watch you're looking at, but it would take Russia 150 years to go through that. Okay, so we're going to try to quicken the pace a little bit. All right, we're going to fast track us to communism because we don't really have time. All right, but when you hear Menshevik and Bolshevik, that's kind of what the split is. All right, they're both Marxists, but they have a different idea on time frame. Okay, all right, so back to Russia then. And I told you, Russia, maybe like if you bought into the theory of war as a domestic political diversion, maybe Russia needed this war more than anybody. Because they had a lot of issues, right? You had a czarist government that was ineffectual. You have land reform that hasn't really effectively happened. You got liberals that were pining for some type of constitutional democracy. You had social revolutionaries that were looking for some kind of agrarian change. You had anarchists that really wanted to just blow up the system. You had Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. You had a whole bunch of different stripes of revolutionaries. You had literary nihilists. You had everything. Okay? And all of them are looking at the one thing that they can agree on, and that is Tsarist Russia is backward beyond repair and something needs to be fixed. And then this becomes sort of like the shiny gold watch. Look over here. Mother Russia is being threatened by the Germans - Austro-Hungarians, and we all need to rally around the flag. Okay? And it worked. Everybody forgot about all that other stuff, at least at the beginning, and said we got to rally around Mother Russia. And so remember when I was telling you about the capitals and how everybody was excited and celebratory. Russia was one of those folks. Okay? So in early 1914, there's an excitement. Okay? And Russia's mobilizing for war. And then what happens in the war? It doesn't go really well. By the middle of 1915, nobody in Russia is excited about the war. A, they are not modernized to a place where they could effectively be able to combat the Germans on a front. All right, they were being sent into battle ill-equipped, in some cases not equipped. All right. Meanwhile, though, because of the harsh requisitions of food and supplies for that Russian army that was having a hard time staying supplied, it was putting an impact on the Russian peasants. Okay? Either A, they weren't able to produce enough food to pay the rents to stay on their lands. So now you have Russian soldiers that are kind of screwed. They're like, well, what am I supposed to do? My wife and my children are starving in the countryside, and I'm fighting kind of a losing cause here. And you have Russian soldiers that are like, well, screw this. They're asking me to run to the front without a weapon. The hell with that, I'm going to desert. And then they're getting shot by the officers as they try to desert. Okay? So you got problems on the countryside, you got problems on the front line, and Russia is badly losing the war on the Eastern Front. So here's just to show you how stupid the whole thing is. Tsar Nicholas, the last of the Romanov czars, right? I call him Pooh too, because he really is just another reproduction of the French royal family, meaning Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. These are people that live in a bubble. They don't have any idea of what the world looks like. They've grown up in palaces, and they've grown up on polo grounds, and they've grown up around privilege, where they interact with other aristocrats. They don't have any idea what it's like to be like a hardworking Russian peasant. And what he knows about war, he probably read from his tutors that talked about, I don't know, like Peter the Great's wars or something in the early 1700s. Okay, so there's no frame. And this is just how quixotically stupid Nicholas was. So the morale is down for the Russian troops, and there's distress on the countryside, and there's bread riots because there's shortages that are going on in St. Petersburg. And Nicholas says to himself, you know what? I will gallop to the front, and I will improve the Russian morale. Which is something that you say in, I don't know, like 1300, where you could actually get on your freaking horse and gallop to the front, and the troops will see that the king has got their back, and everybody will be excited. Like, you're fighting in a war that's got submarines and artillery and, like machine guns and barbed wire and mustard gas, and he's on his horse. Like, it's like Don Quixote fighting windmills. Like, what the hell is the matter with you? But the worst part of it is that Nicholas leaves the Winter Palace to go to the front, which means that his wife, the Tsarina, is in charge. Which means that not just the Tsarina, but this cat is in charge.
Rasputin.
Yes. Does anybody know the backstory on this one? Go ahead.
Didn't he I don't know that much, but didn't he think he was a prophet?
They thought he was a holy man. They
Yeah.
thought that he had healing powers. Okay, his son, remember the Tsarevich, his name is Alexis, and he has hemophilia. All right, means like his blood won't clot, right? And for whatever reason, this Rasputin had an encounter with the royal family, and he's like, "Can you help? Can you help, Rasputin?" He's like, "Of course I can." So he starts like talking to Alexis and gets him calm to a place where like his blood will start clotting. Like they think he can save the kid. All right. So now Alexander's convinced that like he's a divine entity and invites him to the palace, and then he moves in, and then he brings all his drinking buddies with him. Okay. And I mean, you still have class systems, and this guy is low class. All right, he's kind of like a unkempt, doesn't really bathe much, is kind of crude. Supposedly, he's got a really, really decorated sexual history. That also is going to be a big factor because they were convinced that Rasputin had some kind of like hold over Alexandra, and to the point that they might even be having an affair. And so the whole thing was bad, but it got to a place where Alexandra wasn't listening to anybody that was in a high political position in Russia. She was listening to this guy. Okay, and he was manipulating her. There's stories about, just like he would be giving her like policy things that he would want to see done. I mean, it was like as bad as like Anthony Scaramucci becoming like the White House press secretary. Okay, Anthony, like Tony the Mooch. All right, so Rasputin is literally kind of almost ex officio has become like the czar, the acting czar of Russia. This weird, homeless, kind of bohemian, free love oriented, hypnotic, weird dude.
It's like Russell Brand.
Oh, it was such a good. But look at his eyes. I mean, doesn't he scare the hell out of you?
Yeah. Have you ever watched Anastasia?
I mean, I've seen Charles Manson and Rasputin. If you look in their eyes, there's definitely something there. Okay? So anyway, there's a great story that goes along, but it just shows you how far, like, off the deep end the Russian leadership has gotten. Okay? So eventually, in order to save the royal family and save really Russia from embarrassment, a bunch of like the leading aristocrats get together and say Rasputin's got to go. All right. Has anybody heard about this story? All right. So they invite him to this dinner, right? And at least this is the way that I've heard it, or maybe I'm making it up, but it's a good story nonetheless. That there's these desserts or whatever that Rasputin had grown fond of. And they decided to bake those desserts with a whole bunch of arsenic, right? Like enough to kill like 100 people, right? And so they get through with the dinner and they're like, "Hey, try the desserts." Rasputin, "Oh, the gulaches! I love the gulaches." So he's like just going to town on these things, right? And they're looking at him like, and he's not like nothing's happening. It's like, "Oh, you must share recipe. Very good." So, and anyway, they're just like looking at him like, "Dude, you're not dying." Like they're thinking to himself. And then eventually they're like, well, they give up, and then they pull out knives and just start stabbing. So he's like, oh, what this is great, you know. And somehow it like ends up like he's like been poisoned to death, but he doesn't die. Then he's been stabbed a bunch of times, and then he's like trying to flee the palace where he was, where they had this little party, and he's like running through the snow, and then they're firing pistols at him. He's like, ah, this has got to stop, you know, like this kind of. And eventually, like it's cold as hell, and he ends up jumping into like a almost frozen river. And supposedly, like the autopsy was, he died of drowning.
Yeah.
But it's like, I mean, it's like Sonny Corleone, you know, in the scene at the toll booth of The Godfather, where he gets shot like 157 times and he still hasn't gone down. And now everybody's like, well, what if Rasputin really was a holy man? We might have just done something really bad. I thought that door was closed, but it's not. But here's the other thing, and supposedly this is another one of those like legends. But he had been, you know, saying all these like weird holy man things, and then I apparently said to Alexandra that if anything had happened to him, that the Romanov family would not survive. It was just kind of like one of those prophecies. It's like, you will not see sundown if anything happens to me. And it was kind of like, you know, 3 years later, you know, that happens. It's
He was
like
a Christ figure.
One of the sadder stories. So yeah, I mean, it's just kind of the symbol of how like tragicomic the whole thing had become, and how out of touch like the Russian leadership was. And then you kind of you fast forward a little bit, and you end up in the same kind of spot that France would have found itself in June or July of 1789. All right, and that is bread riots outside the capital. And in order to make Russia sound more Russian, they, like for the war, to get everybody kind of rallied around the flag, they renamed St. Petersburg Petrograd. So if you see it written that way, that was kind of like, you know, for the war, to make us sound like cooler, we were going to change the name of our St. Petersburg city to Petrograd. Okay, so the Winter Palace is there. The war it continues to go on, and it's just awful, right? The peasants are starving, people are freezing, people are unemployed, the prices are exorbitant, there's food shortages and a whole bunch of other things going on, and the protests happen. And of course, you know, Nicholas responds the way that, you know, he probably read you're supposed to respond to peasant uprisings, and shoots at them. Okay, so you have a storming of the Bastille kind of situation here. All right, and so because of the calendar, which is a little bit different, the events that they say took place in March actually took place in February. So there's two revolutions in 1917. There's either the March Revolution, which occurred in February, or there's the November Revolution, which occurred in October. Okay, don't worry about that. I usually write it in my notes as like February-March Revolution and then October-November Revolution. But there's two revolutions. All right, and the first one is sensible. It's the part where like the real political element that is at play here is a combination of workers like sans-culottes that are centered in Petrograd, and then liberal kind of what we call cadets or constitutional Democrats that had tried to seize like the machinery of the federal government. Okay, so they knew that the Tsar had to go, and they kind of fast-tracked it to almost like they haven't quite gotten to the place where they can name what they are, but they call it a provisional government. All right, and here's the tragedy of the provisional government. Think about how bad things are in Russia right now. Okay, it is the March Revolution and the provisional government that's led by this combo of Alexander Kerensky and this guy named Prince George Lvov. That the leadership and really the people that are running this phase of the revolution are classical liberal. Like, you would not have found a more free government in Russian history than the government that was created after this revolution. What is preposterously stupid about that?
Because their capitals changed too quickly.
Because it's the point that they're suffering. Remember how, like, when they had the bourgeois phase of the French Revolution, and how the idea that they would say, well, we're trying to protect private property, and we're trying to allow the laws of supply and demand to dictate the price of goods and services. So when the workers are starving and they desperately need food, or they desperately need ceilings on prices, or the peasants need land, or whatever the case is, you've got a government that's standing there and saying, well, we don't violate the laws of private property, and we allow the laws of supply and demand to dictate prices. The Russians got to be looking at it and saying, you've got to be kidding, right? They desperately needed a government that was going to go in and provide for the workers and provide for the peasants. And then the other thing was, get the hell out of the war, because they hated that. But this is a government that was made up of people that thought, well, if they can just get back on the top end of the war and then like help with their allies, et cetera, that maybe victory in the war would lead to profitability because they would have all these new connections with the West. So they kept the war going. All right? And it's at this point that Lenin shows up from his exile. And it's kind of like doing these whistle stops, sort of like on the back of a locomotive, where he would like stop by and wave to the people and then give speeches. And it was, this isn't Lenin the ideologue, this is Lenin the politician that is ultimately running to run the country. Okay, so he's playing the role of politician right now. And he's kind of like, well, what do the people need? And the people are like, well, we would like to not have the war. And the peasants are like, yo, we were promised land reforms like 60 billion times, but we haven't gotten the land reforms yet. And the workers, what are they saying? We want food. We're hungry. And he's like, damn, really? Well, guess what? The Bolshevik Party platform is peace, land, and bread.
Communism.
Yeah. All power to the Soviet. All right. So this is political opportunism for him. But he's like solidifying, because they don't really know who he is yet. So he's got to earn his bones a little bit. But he's like, this is a perfect opportunity. We know that the provisional government's going to fail because it's a do-nothing government. All right? At a time when they need to do something or everything or anything, they're doing nothing. So it's going to be really easy to topple that, but he's just got to wait for his time and his place. The other thing is that while the federal, like whatever this provisional government is doing, it's acting concurrently with this local workers' council around Petrograd called the Soviet. Okay? And they're kind of working almost at cross purposes with one another. Well, one of the acts of the Petrograd Soviet, there's three things that are happening in around the summertime of 1917 in Russia. One is called the July Days, which was kind of like a premature revolution. All right, that's where the Bolsheviks thought they had enough time and energy, and they had enough like infrastructural control that they could seize power and topple the provisional government, and they didn't. And so, like, Lenin had to run into exile again, and some of the others. The second thing was this thing called Army Order Number 1, and you can read about it in Viol, but here's basically what it was. The Petrograd Soviet sort of issued this memorandum that said that the army, the way that it was constructed, the way that they determined officers and enlisted and that sort of thing, was based on, like, artifact. It was based on the idea that the old feudal structure gave officers officer positions because they were born out of aristocratic privilege. So this effort was to democratize the army. Okay? Have you ever heard of anything that would make less sense than democratizing the armed forces in the middle of a war? Okay? Let me give you an example. Taylor, I demand that you take that hill. You're being commanded by an officer to take that hill. And Taylor says, I don't know if I really want to take the hill. I think we should vote. So all those in favor of taking the hill, raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All those in favor, or all those opposed to taking said hill. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Any abstentions? 3. So on a 5 to 8 to 3 vote, we've decided to not take the hill. Okay, that's the absurdity of what Army Order Number 1 was. And really, if they voted, most of them voted to kill the officers. Because the officers had like shot at some of their loved ones who were fleeing to try to help their families. Or they voted to say, all those in favor of leaving the battlefield so that we can go home and try to gain land, aye. And they're like, aye! And then they would just leave. So now like the army is just like, it's like watching somebody where like they took all the security cameras away and all of the security and said, everybody take whatever you can out of Walmart now, go. All right. So in the middle of all of that chaos, there was an army officer by the name of General Lavir, L-A-V-R, however you pronounce that, Kornilov. And Kornilov is like, this is chaos. The provisional government has no control over the country. We need to get this right. So he's waging a military-style coup d'etat, which is cute, because the Bolsheviks are looking at it and going, wait a second, if anybody's going to overthrow the provisional government, it's going to be me. So we got to stop it. So actually the Kornilov affair is settled by the Bolsheviks taking care of Kornilov. And then the provisional government looking at the Bolsheviks and saying, we thought you guys were bad guys, but it turns out that you're good guys. So thanks. And the Bolsheviks are like, no problem. What they were doing was making sure that when the revolution happened, they controlled the revolution, which they were going to do. That was the next order of business. But what they needed was somebody that could do it. Now, Lenin is an ideas guy, but he needed somebody that could command. All right, tomorrow we'll talk about that. Stop time.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Afternoon assembly schedule.
Oh, I think I'm going to defeat a pit. I haven't figured it out.
It's good. I think that's going to be the move.
Sounds like a good one. We want some Chick-fil-A right now.
What?
We want some Chick-fil-A right now.
Chick-fil-A?
Are teachers allowed to go off campus for lunch?
I hope so, because I go off campus for lunch every day.
The leaders of our country.
Are kilts?
Don't know about kilts. Can't speak for the kilts.
So where are we at right now?
6th period. Cannot speak for the kilts.
Good old Rasputin.
What a stud, though.
There's some crazy guy that went down to history because he was
But he died hard. Definitely died hard.
Yeah.
All right, see you.